I think when Katie asked me to do this presentation, it was because I've made a lot of mistakes over the years traveling through the backcountry, and I guess going to try to just pass on a little bit of information that maybe you can avoid some of the mistakes I made if you're thinking about making that jump from front country camping to backcountry camping. Today what we're going to talk about is what is backcountry camping, what are we even talking about? And then you see I've got a whole bunch of lists and numbers, but the idea is to give you some things to think about. 7 principles of leave no trace. I'm going to give you my top 3 tips for moving to the backcountry. I want to help get you familiar with the idea of 10 essentials and the rules of 3. Fun stuff. And then just to get into a little bit more specifics on those 4 areas of shelter, food and water, light and heat, and site selection. So maybe you can see from this, I'm going to be talking about the camping aspect of traveling in the backwoods, but not necessarily about your mode of travel. So I'm not going to talk about canoeing or navigation or hiking, but mostly about the camping part of it. So what is backcountry camping? It's remote. So we're talking about places that are way back in the woods. They're undeveloped and hard to access. And the things that we think of when we think about that is you're on your own and what you have is what you have. And I think that's what we're looking for when we go into the backcountry. But the answer could be different for everyone. These are some of my answers. I go to the backcountry to get away from it all. And by all, I usually mean people. And so Sartre said that l'enfer c'est les autres. He's saying that hell is other people. And it's maybe an exaggeration, but when I go in the woods, it's just to find that quiet and peace and beauty. I'm looking for unspoiled, pristine wilderness, connecting with nature, and maybe some challenge or adventure. So that whole adventure versus adversity aspect is a big part of backcountry camping. It's a balance that you want to keep in mind all the time. You want adventure, so you want fun and challenge, and you want a good story at the end of the day, but you want to minimize your adversity. So that is being cold and wet and in pain or lost or scared. You want to maximize adventure and minimize adversity, ideally, unless you like adversity. So another way to look at that is a good adventure has a high perceived risk and a low actual risk. So even if you look at this photo on this slide, it looks like we're in a backcountry situation. There's nothing around, no development, looks like a pretty wild place on the coast, but we drove here. So we have a good story, we have a beautiful story of being in a beautiful place, but the risk is low. And you can still go into the backcountry keeping that's why we go maybe for that challenge and adventure, but we want to keep at all times the actual risk as low as possible. So today we're going to talk about how do we take that step from the front country camping. And so I'm going to assume that everyone is this format is difficult because I can't see anyone, and I hope you're responding well to what I'm saying, but I can't see, I can't tell. So I hope you're all familiar with front country camping, more or less, and you're just interested in how do I go beyond somewhere remote, undeveloped, and hard to access? And what are some of the important things you need to think about before taking that step? So first, I'm going to talk about leave no trace. I do want to say right off the bat that wherever it is you decide to go backcountry camping, you should make sure you have permission to be there. It's pretty obvious in Keji, we have permission to camp on the campsites if we've paid and registered for a site. And if you know the boundaries of the Tobeatic Wilderness area, you're allowed to camp pretty much wherever you want, although it's better to use an established campsite, and we'll get to that. And the same with the Medway Lakes Wilderness area. But if you don't know who owns a piece of property, you really should find out and make sure you do have permission. So I mentioned the Keji, Tobeatic, and the Medway Lakes Wilderness area because we are blessed in the southwestern end of Nova Scotia with a large area of true wilderness, remote, undeveloped, hard to access places. We are so blessed, and with these awesome responsibilities or opportunities comes responsibility, because we want to make sure that those who come after us can also enjoy getting away from it all. So that's why we don't leave garbage behind or dispose of our waste improperly. We want to make sure that those who come after us can also have unspoiled beauty of the pristine wilderness, that they can connect with nature. And also, like, leaving no trace will help us maintain the challenge and adventure. So for example, if you build a new trail because you think the woods needs a trail, or if you build a bench or a picnic table, I've seen all of this, well, you've diminished the challenge and the adventure for the next person. Not only have you left the sign of yourself passing through, so now I get to think about people, but you've diminished my challenge, my adventure. So leave no trace is a way of maintaining the wilderness so that others can enjoy it just the same as you. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Leave No Trace. I want you to know it exists. I gave you the webpage, leavenotrace.ca, and just show you the 7 principles of Leave No Trace. I think these are smart ways. These are all the things you want to know anyway. These are the way you want to behave for your own safety and for your own enjoyment. So planning ahead and preparing is only smart. And it also will protect the wilderness. The quickest, easiest example of that is if you knew in advance the trail was muddy, you would take waterproof boots and you would walk through the mud. But if you arrive there and there's mud and you have the wrong shoes, you might be tempted to make a new trail around the mud. And the next person make a new trail around your mud, and so on until we have this braided trail. That's just an example of how planning ahead and preparing will help protect the wilderness. Travel and camp on durable surfaces is pretty obvious. Disposing of your waste properly, which really means take it out with you if at all possible. If you can carry it in, you should be able to carry it out. Leave what you find behind for the next person to enjoy it as well. Minimize your fire impacts. And this gets its own, I mean, it doesn't need, you could include that in any of the other areas, but minimize fire impacts gets its own line because it is probably the biggest scar that we make. It's where our footprints become the heaviest, is when we make fires in the woods. Respect wildlife, and then be considerate of others. But you can find out more information about Leave No Trace at leavenotrace.ca. So my top 3 tips. So the first one is test your gear before you leave your house. Be familiar with your gear. And this picture is meant to illustrate that. My son and I, he was 12, we went on a camping trip at Cape Chignecto, and we borrowed a tent from friends. And we assumed that it had everything it needed, but it didn't quite have all the poles. So we built a pole out of a spruce branch to keep the tent up that night. That's just to underline, if you're not familiar, if you've never set up a tent before, the woods, 10 kilometers back in the forest is not the time to start figuring out how to set up a tent. It's a 3 or 4 hour hike into the highlands of Cape Breton. I set up camp. I slept the night alone in Pollett's Cove. When I woke up in the morning, I realized I'd brought stove, I brought water, I brought my coffee cup, but I did not bring the coffee. And my state of addiction at that time meant I had to leave the woods. And simply because I hadn't checked my list twice and hadn't brought the coffee. And third top, make sure you leave yourself lots of time to set up your camp. again, what I was saying, if you're not familiar with your gear, you might be a little bit slower. As a beginner, you might be slower setting up your camp. And I would say 2 hours is not a long time to set up a tent, gather firewood if you need to, get water. And what I'm thinking about here is darkness. Now, obviously, you have more time in the summer, but as you get into fall and winter, you want to make sure that you've lots of time to get your camp ready before darkness falls. Those would be my top three tips. And this is just to show an example of a good list. If you don't have one yourself, I mean, they're all over the internet. The one I use comes from Canoe Annapolis. And I'll be giving the link to the online version of Canoe Annapolis, but there's also a great hard copy book. And this is the list I use every single time I go camping. I just pull out this book, I go through it. I don't bring everything on this list, but I think about whether or not I might need it or might not need it. And every time I'm like, oh yeah, thank heavens, coffee. Yeah, better add that to the list. So I wanted everyone to be aware of this idea called the 10 essentials. And there used to be a list of 10 things that every person should have. They've changed it over the years. And now what you find is the 10 essential systems. So these are like areas or things that you need to cover, not with a particular item, but just make sure that you've thought about this particular area. So you could use a list like the Canoe Annapolis list, or you could use this thought process. So you want to make sure you have something for navigation. If that's your phone, if that's a GPS, that's a compass that you can actually use, you definitely want a map. So nutrition is pretty obvious. That's your food, and hydration is water. And you may not, we'll talk about water again. You may not carry it all, but you need a means of purifying it if you're not carrying it all. So protection includes your shelter and tent, but also bug spray, sunscreen. Chris Hadfield, the astronaut, the question he asks is, what is going to kill me next? And that's also a really helpful thought process when you're going in the woods, just thinking about, okay, the bugs right now are bad, so I better have a bug net. Or it's going to be really sunny this weekend, I should have a big floppy hat. Insulation, again, is warm clothes or a sleeping bag as well. Illumination is some kind of light source. First aid is pretty obvious. A means of starting a fire. Unless you're able to rub two sticks together, you want either matches or a lighter. And repair refers to any of your gear that you're really dependent on. So a means of repairing your tent, if that's a thread and needle. If you're canoeing, then you want a means of repairing that fragile piece of equipment. If a part of it breaks, you want to be able to fix it. And communication is, these days, there's pretty good cell phone access all through Keji, for example, a lot of the Tobiatic, a lot of the Medway Lakes Wilderness area. You might bring it, keep it turned off. And the other thing that's really common, and you can borrow them if you don't own them, are satellite messaging devices that, because they exist now, they're a really good idea to take them if you can afford them or get them, for sure. So those are that's just a quick look at the idea of 10 essentials, but when you're doing your list or thinking about your trip, hopefully you'll think about covering those 10 areas. And I just threw this one in because it helps you think about priorities. I'm not saying that you could, if you're going away for the weekend, you don't need food and water, because you might think that from the first two lines. But it helps you with your priorities. If you're in an emergency situation, I'm going to assume that you can breathe, but really the first thing you want to worry about is getting yourself shelter. And it might seem extreme, but in winter or in very, very hot, extremely hot conditions, 3 hours without shelter can be deadly. And then after that, you want to look after your water situation and then food. Just something to, those are all, I think, all my numbers. I think I'm through with the list for now. Yeah, so I'm going to get specific about the various areas that you could think about. And I wanted to start with this poem by Marchette Chute, an English professor from the States. Under the dark is a star, under the star is a tree, under the tree is a blanket, under the blanket is me. And that's really about all you need to know about shelter. But we'll look a little closer. So usually we're talking about a tent, but it could also be a hammock, and that's becoming more and more popular. They're lighter. Some people find them easy to set up. I don't. Some people find them incredibly comfortable. But it could also be a bivy sack, and that is a waterproof, perhaps a snowproof covering that goes over your sleeping bag. And you'll see in this photo, I was sleeping near a friend, but I was sleeping in a bivy sack. He was sleeping in a tent. And if you know that it's not going to rain or be totally miserable, a bivy sack is a great option. If you know the weather forecast has got no dew or no rain in it, you could just sleep in your sleeping bag or under blankets. And I've also slept under a tarp or a canoe as well. So the question is, what are you looking for protection from? And that's what you want to think about when you're considering, am I bringing a tent? Am I bringing a tarp? Am I bringing anything? Rain or dew, wind, cold, sun, snow, bugs. And there's also a psychological element. So some people would be very uncomfortable sleeping in a bivy sack, either because they have to close it up over their face at night and it's claustrophobic, or because it just doesn't provide the roominess and the shelter of a tent. So sometimes, like I did a 12-day trip through the Tobiatic by myself once, and even though it's heavier, I took my tent because I needed that psychological retreat by myself, and just to crawl into my little safe tent was very helpful to me psychologically. But I've done other trips, short trips, where I can stand it for a night to be sleeping out under the stars alone. It's much easier. In this case, you'll see that there's a group of us sleeping on the beach. It's much easier psychologically to sleep out with no tent when there's a group of you. And in fact, this afternoon of this picture, we had seen a bear just on the shore in the background there, pop her head out of the bushes. So we all did kind of get our knives and machetes close by, but psychologically we were okay just because we were in a group. And I mentioned, like, so if you look at bugs, for example, sometimes I'll just take my tent, but I won't put the fly on because I know it's not going to rain. There's not going to be any dew, but I want to see the stars, and I have a screen roof on my tent, so I'll just leave the fly off. But other days, if I know it's going to rain hard, I'll not only put the fly on my tent, but I'll put a tarp over my fly so that my tent never, ever gets wet. And if you're talking about like snow and wind and stormy, then you're talking another level tent, and this is only a beginner discussion, but just to point out that you really want to think about, is the tent or the tarp that I'm bringing going to protect me from the things that I'm going to experience? And I guess I'm getting really technical now, but there are 5 ways that we lose heat. So conduction is like when we touch the earth. So if you touch a metal building or touch something metal, you know how it takes your heat away very quickly. Like a metal roof gets hot quickly and it gets cold quickly. So when we lay on the earth is much like metal. If we lay just on the bare earth, it's going to take away our heat very quickly. Evaporation, if we get wet, then all the heat from our body will be spent drying out our clothes, and our heat will go up in vapor as it evaporates. Radiation is, you just can't win with that. No matter what you do, heat radiates away from your body. Convection is when wind comes in. There's always, if air didn't move, it is the best insulator, and there's always a sort of warm layer around your skin until the wind comes and steals it away. And then respiration is breathing, and we lose a significant amount of heat through breathing as well. And on this slide, I've just put in some of the ways that you can address these modes of heat loss. So for conduction, you want to have an air mattress or pad under you. For evaporation, you want to stay dry. That's number 1. So a waterproof tent, fly, and tarp will help you. Radiation, any roof over you will help you with the radiation, as long as it's not see-through. And this is important. I mean, what happens on a night when there's no clouds, your heat is literally radiating to the moon. Those are the colder nights, when the heat radiates away from the earth and then also away from you. So for convection, you want windproof covering to stop the wind from stealing the heat. And then respiration, there's a solution, but you aren't going to like it very much. There's only one way to stop losing heat by respiration, and it's not a good one. So I want to, two things about shelters. Again, you should test it and be familiar with the setup. So as I told you the story before about the pole at Cape Chignecto. And I'm going to tell another story about you should really make sure your tent is big enough for the people that are going to sleep in it, even for yourself. I've seen a lot of people get small tents that I'm 6'2". I have to make sure my tent is big enough that I can stretch my legs out, or it can be very uncomfortable. And my tent does fit me very well. It's rated for 1 3/4 people. So I think they're thinking a person and a dog, or a person and a child. But actually on this particular trip, my son, a full-grown man, and myself, and Opie the dog were in the tent. And Opie was tossing and turning. It took him a long time to settle down. And he got very cozy with me and my son. And at one point, he finally settled down. And I said, Johnny, that's my son, Johnny, Opie just gave me a kiss on the face. And Johnny said, Dad, his head is down at this end. So I don't know if you're smiling at that story, but that's just a good reason to make sure your tent is big enough for the people that are going to sleep in it. Or, I mean, you can do these things my way and you have good stories. Just to quickly talk about tarps. So they're super handy at lunch, if it's raining or windy, or even too sunny. Tarp is perfect for your kitchen or your common area. And two last things about tarps. If you're putting a tarp over your tent, is a super great idea. Not just leave everything up to your fly, because your fly will eventually get wet enough that the rain will soak through it and you'll start to get wet inside. But with a tarp that doesn't touch your tent, you could stay dry for days in a rainstorm. If you're going to put a tarp under your tent, you have to make sure none of it is sticking out, because then it'll just, if it's sticking out under, like on the outside of your tent, the rain that comes off your tent or off your tarp will run onto that tarp on the ground and go under your tent and make sure and get you wet. So you have to tuck every bit of it in under your tent. And here's a great use of tarps. This is in Pollett's Cove to keep our tent dry. We were there for 2 or 3 days. And also we had our kitchen area where we were out of the wind. So a pad, I mean, I always used foam pads for years, but now these self-inflating pads are fantastic because the air is such a great insulator. If you love carrying things, you could bring lots of blankets and put them under you, or your extra clothes. Or you could camp in a spot that has thick grass but isn't wet. That's the trick. But thick grass is also a great insulator. And I just mentioned about sleeping bags. You know, in the summer, it doesn't really matter. Most sleeping bags are going to work out fine. You spend more money to get lighter sleeping bags, and that's it. But basically, I mean, you could take a blanket on a summer trip and still be pretty happy. And I already mentioned bivy sacks are a waterproof covering, and they also will add, 10 degrees of warmth to your sleeping bag. So if you can't afford a real expensive sleeping bag, you can buy an expensive bivy sack, and it'll make you warmer and drier. And I want to mention pillows. You can buy now pillows just like your air mattress, so it's something you blow up for a pillow. But I just always use some bag, my sleeping bag, I stuff it full of my extra clothes or other bags I have, and I've got a pillow. I never bring a pillow, but I was on a hike once. I took some scouts into the woods, and the young fella had 2 pillows. So again, it's up to you. Do as you wish, but I don't carry a pillow. So on to food and water. I'm sorry I don't have a photo here, but first we're going to talk about water. Water is essential, right? You can get by for, what do we say, 3 days without water. But it's also heavy, and it's a good way to get sick. There is no water in Nova Scotia that you can trust. If it's not contaminated by humans, it's very likely contaminated by beavers. And beavers carry a sickness that will make you very sick as well. So there is no water source in Nova Scotia that you can trust. So, and we'll get back to the next slide. We'll talk about how to purify it. But just to remind you, you need it not only for drinking, you probably need it for cooking. You also need it for hygiene. And then there's your dishes and cleaning. So how do you purify it? And I'm not going to go into super big details here, but these days filters they've come down a lot in price, and they're easy to get. In my day, we had to pump water through, and you can still buy good pumps, but you can get these Life straws now, or the Sawyer Squeeze Me, which are like a straw. So you can actually just scoop up some water, put these straws in it, and you're drinking clean water. You can also combine the straws, so you have a gravity feed system. So you just you get a big bladder full of water, you hang it up, it goes through the filter on its own and into a receptacle that's clean, where you have your good clean water. And that is the way to go, the gravity feed. Especially if you're a big group, you're staying somewhere for a long time, that gravity feed system, they're light and they're easy and way better than pumping. You could use chemicals. I've never done it. I have the water tabs in my emergency kit, and basically you add these little like a pill. You shake them up, and you've got maybe not the best tasting water in the world, but it's safe water. And in an emergency, that's fine. And then there's always a standard boiling. As soon as water boils, it is ready to drink. They always say like boil it for 2 minutes, and that's just to make sure that it really has boiled. But as soon as water boils, it's safe to drink. So that if you're having a campfire, and we'll talk about that in a minute, that's the easiest way, is you have a kettle and boiling all the time. So food. Now, we could write a book on it. There's been many books written about food in backcountry, and this is just a very beginner presentation today. So I just want to point out the basics that you need to keep in mind. That number one, food is fuel. You need it to keep you moving, to keep you warm, and to keep you smart. It can also serve as a morale booster, and it's also a time to gather around and team building. And for many people, let's be honest, for me, the food is one of the reasons I go. I look forward to what I'm going to eat. And you'll see in this photo, my son is cooking. We made at home scallops wrapped in bacon, and they're frozen. We froze them so that they'd stay cool that first night. And we usually have bacon wrapped scallops our first night. That's just that's the only recipe I'm going to give you. But like I said, I look forward to that meal. That's one of the reasons I go camping, is otherwise I can't really afford scallops every night. And here's my second recipe, marshmallows on a stick. So on this slide, we're going to talk about planning ahead at home. It might sound simple, but some people think they can just go grab a bunch of food, throw it in their bag, and you really want to think it through, because A, you don't want to carry too much, and B, you want to make sure you have enough, which is probably more important. You want to make sure that the food that you're going to take is actually something you can transport. If it's a liquid, that's going to be more involved. If it needs to be cold, again, that's more involved. You may have to freeze it or pack it in a very special way. And you also want to think about, what do I need to cook it? So as soon as you're thinking about frying something, instead of just boiling something, you're looking at a bigger pan. And what do I need to eat it? Do I need a fork? Do I need a plate? Do I need a napkin? And think also ahead to, like, I'm taking out this garbage. What is the garbage of this meal going to look like? And that includes, like, some people might, I'm not saying I did, but maybe I may have once taken a whole squash with me on a backcountry trip. Well, you've got all of the rind, the shell of the squash to take out with you the next day. That's the kind of thing you have to, all the seeds too, and the gunk from the inside. So that's the kind of thing you want to think through in advance. And extra means, depending on the length of your trip, you always want to have extra food. So if it's just a day trip you're going on, then we're talking a few extra snacks in case you get stuck overnight and something to get you through the night. If it's a 2 or 3 day trip, you might want to consider having an extra day's worth of food. If it's a week or 2 weeks, you might want to consider, again, having more extra food. Just because we're going, remember, to this remote place, it's hard to access, and things happen, and you may be there longer than you expect. Just a few words on food and safety. So you can freeze things that you want to stay cold, or you can pack them in. Sometimes I'll take food that I want to stay hot, and I'll pack it in my extra socks, my wool socks. Whatever's perishable, you got to eat that first. So don't leave the banana for day 4. Word to the wise there. Unless you're going to be with your pack every moment, you want things in an animal-proof container. So that's depending on what it is. So a lot of times the food we're taking is freeze dried anyway, so there's not a lot of smell or problem there. But it's when you have, say, peanuts in a plastic bag and they can smell them, and the mice decide to get into it, or the squirrels. At night, you want to hang your food well away from your camp and well up in the air. And this is because you don't want to teach bears or other animals that humans are a source of food. And you also don't want them coming in your tent. So you don't eat in your tent or cook in your tent. And never leave cans or other food debris in a campfire, because again, you're teaching wildlife that humans and human fires are a source of food or things that smell good. So on to light and heat. It does get dark out there. It's surprising how dark, and that's part of that challenge and adventure. To really be in a place where it gets truly, truly dark is exciting and fun. So here's some, this is about light. Here's some sources of light. Your campfire is an important one, but it's hard to bring in the tent. Candles, they're just not smart to bring in your tent. They'll either set your tent on fire, or the exhaust from the candle will asphyxiate you. So either way, it's just not a good idea. Lanterns are bright and lots of light, but they can be heavy and cumbersome. Flashlights, the negative is that you have to hold them. And the headlamp is you will blind your friends. But that being said, a headlamp is really the best, I think the best choice. It's light, easy to carry, and it only lights up the thing that you need to actually see. So a couple tips on using your headlamp. Find it early. So don't wait till it's dark to go looking for your headlamp. You're in a catch-22 then. You need your light to find your light. You're in a hard situation. So I usually find it as soon as I think about it, when I get into camp, and I just wear it around my neck. That's the great thing about the strap on it. And I actually sleep with it around my neck. It doesn't, you may have another system, but I also put my glasses and toilet paper where I know where they are at night. And you may have other things that you want to know. Maybe it's firecrackers or a camera. But for me, I want to know where my light is. I want to know where my glasses are, and I want to know where my toilet paper is before I go to bed at night. And the other top tip with a headlamp, a lot of them now have a toggle button. So they just need one little push and they're on. So if you want to make sure your batteries last, take your batteries out, pack your backpack. That way your batteries won't be dead when you go to find it. So on to heat and the advantages of a stove. So they're easier on the protected space. And I know it seems like we're being a bit of a hypocrite here, because we're just displacing our environmental impact, right? We're taking fuel from somewhere in the world and we're burning that in the protected space. But this is how we have to move forward. We're gonna decide that some places will be protected and some places will be industrial. And so you could say that all work is pollution. Like if we do anything, we're polluting the world, and that's true. So we want to minimize our impact, and we're going to, in protected spaces, if we take a stove, then we're going to be less harmful to those protected spaces. And there's some places and seasons where fires are just not allowed. So Cape Chignecto Provincial Park, for example, doesn't allow fires, although you'll see that many people build them there. And it's had a huge impact on the environment there. It's really depressing because fires are not allowed, and firewood is not therefore available. People are gathering their own firewood, and a lot of people go to that park, and you'll see when you go there that all the branches are broken off all the trees, and that people are actually cutting down trees. And then we were talking about seasons. Right now, we have a fire ban on, so you can't really legally have a fire until after 7 p.m. So it's not a smart time right now to have a fire in the woods. So in that sense, a stove is better. And also there's seasons where fire is very difficult, like the winter or a rainy season. And stoves are just plain faster for cooking, and your pots will not get as dirty with a stove. So, and some of the same things apply with a stove. You should test it and use it at home before you get back in the woods. You should know how to use it before you're 10 kilometers back in the woods. And your stove does not go in your tent. You'll see pictures of people cooking in their vestibule. But these are people who know what they're doing, and they're not in their tent, but in the vestibule, because in the tent, again, you'll asphyxiate yourself or you'll burn your tent down, neither of which are good ideas. So fire, and I know I've just spoken about why stoves are better, but we're all going to use fire at some point, and fire fulfills roles like cooking, and it does provide light. It provides warmth. Again, it's a social gathering, and it's an important psychological boost. The thing is to make sure that you're not depleting the wood source in that area. And there's some places where that works out really well, where the trees are dropping a lot, and places that aren't frequented. But as soon as you get into a place where a lot of people are going, then you have to really consider if your fire is worth it and the impact that you're going to do to that area. Because I said, like, fire impacts get their own line in the leave no trace information, because that's the biggest scar we see. So you should only build a fire on durable surfaces. Now, in this particular photo, you'll see our fire is in the humus, but we dug through actually the humus, put it aside, and we had a small fire. And once that was extinguished later, we buried it back over, so that my goal is always, I don't want anyone to know where I was. I always play the game in my head that I'm being tracked, and I want to hide every trace of where I've been. So if you can use an established fireplace, that's the best. Please don't build new fire rings. This is a big problem in a lot of places. People come in, and of course they've seen the pictures of fire rings and they want to build their own. Well, pretty soon you end up at a campsite that's got 4 fire rings. And so that's, instead of one little impact, we have 4 more impacts. So don't build new ones, use established ones. And then this little rhyme, start it late, keep it small, burn it all, it really says it all. There's no sense starting your fire in the afternoon. I hope I'm not going to disparage anyone listening, but have you ever been through Keji in the afternoon when everyone has their fire smoldering and the place is just full of smoke, and you think, why do they have a fire now? So to be responsible with your fire, you want to start it at night, when that's when you need the psychological boost. You might need the warmth. When you're making supper, you might need it to cook with. Keep it small, and burn it all means if you start a log into the fire, don't take it out half charred, but you got to plan ahead a little and get that everything that you start to burn, finish to burn, and then extinguish it well. And the other thing I do, you see that small pile of wood in the back, is once if I haven't burned it all, I will scatter that. I'm not going to leave a pile of wood. Again, this goes just back to no trace. I don't want people to know I was there. And I don't know, a pile of wood probably isn't offensive, but again, it's that whole thing. I don't want to diminish anyone else's challenge. I don't want them to know that I was there, because that's diminishing their getting away from it all. I don't want to be somebody else's, remembering that above other people. I just want them to come into a place same as I found it. I guess I've gone over a lot of this. You know, a lot of people walk through the woods and they're like, oh, birch bark. Birch bark is really, really great for starting fires. And what you should do is when you see it is remember, there's birch bark. If I need it, that's where it is. But birch bark will stay driest exactly where it is. And a lot of people go through the woods and gather it all day, and then they only use one piece. And they'll bring it home where you don't need it. So leave it on the tree until you do need it. And that goes for almost all firewood. When you're gathering your firewood for your campfire, you might gather that and process it into various size pieces before dark and have it all ready for dark. And then assemble it when ready, trying to keep it as dry as possible. When you're done, scatter your leftovers. And really, you don't need an axe or a hatchet. You just don't need them. For the kind of campfires that we're talking, these small campfires, you can break dead branches. That's all you need, or dead wood. You would only need an axe or a hatchet if you were getting into something too big. And we don't want to do that. We're making too big an impact on the forest. And another little tip is if you do have a little dry tinder or kindling, put that under a tarp at night so that in the morning it's dry for your fire. And if you don't use it, scatter it. And just so now some final words on site selection. It's pretty easy at Keji because you reserve your site. In the Toby Attic, you can look at, there's some maps online. So I've given the URL right here, and Heba is going to send these around, so you'll be able to get that URL. The Medway Lakes Wilderness Area also has a map that shows campsites. And you can also go to Canoe Annapolis at that link, and it will show you some campsites too. Now, some of these maps are more accurate than others. So just be prepared for a plan B sometimes. They're pretty good, but occasionally you might arrive there and not find the campsite. And I'll just underline again, ideally you want to use an established site. You should always, I mentioned earlier, start looking for a camp early. Try to camp on durable surfaces. Don't clear new campsites. Most of the time you want to be near water, unless you've brought a lot with you, because it's useful for hydration, for cooking, swimming, and the view. When we talk about the view versus shelter idea, sometimes you may want to camp on top of a hill in the summer where there's wind, because they'll keep the bugs away and keep you cool. But in the winter, you might want to camp under the lee of the hill, out of the wind, because you'll be less cold. So again, think about the wind, think about the view, think about shelter. And maybe a final consideration is if you're going to have a fire, look for a place with good firewood. And basically, you're going to look for white pine because it burns so quickly. And also, usually they grow in pretty dry areas. So under white pine is a great place to camp. And as I said before, try to leave no clues that you were there. So that gets me through it. I have no idea how you've been responding, but maybe there's some questions that I can help you with.
All right, great. Thank you so much. That was really informative. I particularly actually really liked mentioning the psychological aspect of it. I think that's missed in a lot of presentations about kind of like backcountry camping, just camping in general. So that was really interesting. So for our first question, what's the best self-inflating sleeping pad in your opinion?
Thanks for that question. I'm the worst. I'm not a gearhead. So, and I didn't say that during the presentation, but really for me, and that's why I mentioned like blankets and bedrolls and even grass. Like for me, the important thing is getting out there. And I guess another thing about me is I have a high tolerance for adversity. So a lot of my adventures have more adversity than adventure. But I would say you really can't go wrong. I hope this is within the guidelines, but you really can't go wrong with MEC products. And I've used one of their self-inflatable mattresses for years. I think with their return policy, so for beginners especially, like some of these items, like that tent you saw in every picture, and the air mattress, these are significant investments if you don't have a lot of disposable income. And at MEC, if you're not happy, return policy is so great. So they have some great air mattresses, and that's the way I go. You can do better if you're a gearhead, but I'm sorry, I'm not a gearhead. I don't know. I'm not that guy. Sorry.
Great, thank you. So next question is, what's the maximum amount of water you'll carry before it just makes more sense to filter or boil the water on site?
So you've actually, my friends and I have been talking about this a lot because so it really depends on how much time you're going to spend in between water sources. So this goes back to that plan ahead and prepare. So I do a lot of my traveling by canoe. I don't carry much water at all because I'm always going to be near water and I'm always going to have a chance to filter it. And I have one of these straw systems where I just scoop up some water and I can suck it right out of the straw. So generally I have a liter or two of already filtered water and if you're hiking though, it might be more. I don't think you're going to go beyond 3 liters. That's a lot of water. But you've got to plan. How long will I be away from water? And make sure you have the water that will last you that length of time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So last question is, do you pack and carry out your toilet paper or burn it or bury it?
Great question. So it is a great question. And I'm going to recommend a book called How to Shit in the Woods. And it will give you all the answers. I'm not sure if it's still in print, but I think it is. And so there are places in the United States, for example, you're not allowed to leave your fecal waste behind. You have to take it out. And what they do, they take what are they called? Ammunition cans. These metal cans that used to store ammunition, and that's where all their waste ends up. So to answer your question, because it was a you question, I guess it varies, but mostly we do some burning and we do some burying. I don't think ever carried it out, but generally. So when I go to places like Cape Chignecto, those are some of the places where you're getting. Another place where you get a lot of impact is Pollett's Cove. So this is going to conflict. Like at Cape Chignecto, there's a lot of impact from people on that area, but there's outhouses, so it balances out. In Pollett's Cove, you see a lot of toilet paper, and it's horrible, and that's angry. So Pollett's Cove is a place where I burn it, even though it's not the funnest thing in the world. But you could have 2 campfires, and in Pollett's Cove is such a large beach, you can have a campfire for fecal matter and toilet paper, and you can have and it's hard there to find a place to bury it where someone else hasn't already buried it. But most of the time, I'm traveling in places where there's less people, and in those situations, I feel okay to find somewhere that's private, well away from camp, well away from water sources, to bury it. So there's a complete answer. You know all about my toilet habits now.
Great. So we have a couple more questions.
Okay, let's go more personal.
Yeah. So kind of on that note a little bit, is it okay to bury compostable material, and where is it possible to bury it adequately, or is it an animal attraction issue?
Yeah, I can't recommend that. If I'm not sure what it is you're composting. Maybe it's coffee grounds. I don't know what maybe it's your apple core. So with the apple core, for example, if that's your worry, then quarter your apple before you go and leave your core at home. If it's the squash, don't be like Jonathan. Don't take the squash, because then you get all those seeds to carry home and all that skin. So yeah, just don't do it. Or if you do it, take responsibility, right? If you carried it in, you can carry it out. I guess the coffee grounds is sort of one of those challenges, like, oh, that's going to be a mess. But a little bit of planning, I'm sure you could come up with a way to get your coffee grounds out. Yes, it's going to attract animals. It's really unnecessary. And, as far as that goes, so if we're going to be Puritans about it, I should also be carrying out my other waste, but I guess I draw the line there. But so we all have to draw our lines. compostable material should go with you. I wouldn't, in protected areas, I wouldn't throw out an apple core. I just don't feel it's right. And banana peels, people think they're gonna decompose quickly. They don't. They're there forever. They're there for weeks. And the other thing, like I'll get to a beautiful look off, and there'll be pistachio shells, and people think, oh, that's natural. That'll decompose. Right, but I've just been reminded that people have been up here and wasteful. Take your pistachio nuts home with you. If you can carry them in, carry them out. That's my rant for the day.
Absolutely, yeah. So one last question. Can you speak again to legal backcountry camping in Nova Scotia? For example, Cloud Lake Wilderness. How do you know there's a camp spot / fire pit where you're going?
Right, that's a really, really good question. And it goes back to plan ahead and prepare. So, yeah, I mean, the other thing I should mention is like a lot of times I camp on the coast. It's a very durable surface, and I'm sort of surfing that line between legal and illegal because we all have permission to be up to the mean high tide mark. And so you can usually, and Nova Scotians generally are pretty tolerant of that kind of activity on the shore. So a lot of times I will camp on beaches and shores where I just feel you're not harming anyone's property rights that way. So like at the Cloud Lake Wilderness area, never camped there, would love to. But I think before I went, I've sort of introduced this idea by Frank Muse of Bear River that when he goes to a new area, he kind of wants to be invited, or he wants to have someone sort of take them there. So if you're going to a place so in the Midway Lakes Wilderness area, we have a map. In the Tobiatic, we have a map. In the Cloud Lake, we don't have a map yet. But so what I would put back to you is find somebody who knows that area. And with Facebook now and all the other means of quickly communicating with a large number of people, you're going to find someone with a little bit of effort who knows. And I mean, I don't know the Cloud Lake Wilderness area, but I get emails and phone calls and text messages and Facebook messages all the time. Where do I camp? And people love to share that kind of information. So I would, you got to find somebody who can help you get you introduced or scout it out. So the first time you go, you don't have to spend the night. In fact, I would recommend that, right? Go in for a day, check things out, find one, find two. But actually, and I'm not certain about this, but again, go back to that Canoe Annapolis book. They indicate campsites. Again, they may not be 100% accurate, but they will give you hints about where campsites are. And then third case is, I mean, we can't always know where they are. We can guess though. So when you get on a lake, most people camp in the summer and they like to camp on like exposed points or places or hills or dry areas or under the white pine, and just check those. So if you don't know, and you've got to leave yourself more time. So you're into that challenge adventure thing. And so it's kind of fun. Like I got to find a campsite. Maybe there is one, maybe there isn't one. But I got to find the best spot I can. So A, if there's an established site, that's choice A. But B, maybe there's a beach. Well, if there's a beach, then you're good, right? That is a very durable surface and you're not going to do a huge impact. You're not going to clear brush. You're not going to leave too many traces behind. Maybe there's a nice big flat rock, exposed granite or exposed basalt. Perfect place to camp. You're not going to cause any great impacts. Those are my thoughts on that. Great question.
Great. So I think that's about it for questions.
It was too fun.
Yeah, right? We had a lot of great questions, actually. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for taking time out of your day to present about this topic. Thank you for everyone who attended and asked questions. It's really great. Next week's webinar is on migratory birds and forestry. So that's in our forestry professional series. Our next webinar in this series, so the intro to the forest series, is on medicinal plant and wild foods foraging. So that'll be kind of more on theme if you're interested more in hiking, camping, but if you want to go more into forestry, next week's is on more like a forestry related topic. But either way, I think both are interesting. So attend if you can. But that's about it. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much again. Yeah, have a great day.
Thanks.